Hello, everybody. Welcome to another recap. This is for game number 5 of the World Chess Championship. Jan Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces, Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces. And I think everyone was kind of waiting for that moment. And would it be today in the match where we finally get a decisive result? Of course, the first player to draw blood, so to speak, will definitely have a big advantage in this match. And I feel like after 4 games, the players generally know a lot about the other's preparation, about how they've played and where they might be weak, and certainly what they might expect them to play in the match in general in future rounds. So game number 5, definitely a point where you might expect things to get a little bit wild. However, with Jan with the white pieces, one thing was kind of for sure, which is that e4 move 1 is to be expected. So Jan does start with the move e4, and Magnus pretty much has shown his colors in this match. Obviously, he had the Sicilian prepared for his match with Fabiano, but in this match we see e4, e5 is pretty much a staple for the world champion. And Ruy Lopez, knight f6, that we've seen this all before, and it really just comes down to what is Nepo going to do, or what is Magnus going to do, who's going to deviate, because we've seen these games before when Nepo's had the white pieces. And after castling, a4 was tried by Nepo in this particular game. h3 and a4 both have been played in this match, and it really all comes down to the anti-martial. Right, this d pawn moving to d5 is pretty much the main idea for black, and it's a dangerous line and a very drawish one, but also with some sting to it. So Nepo is choosing which line that he wants to play in terms of the anti-martial, and then Magnus is sort of choosing between the sidelines or the sub variations within those lines. So a4 was played, rook b8. Again, we've seen h3, we've seen a4, rook b8 takes, and previously we've seen bishop b7 as well. This is just another try, I guess you could say. So after the current a takes b5 has displayed itself in the position, white decides to go for h3, and basically he's saying to Magnus, look, if you want to play d5 so badly, this is the best you're going to get. So if Magnus does play the move d5, right, and goes into something that sort of looks like a martial, let's just say something like this, it's the best you're going to get as black for a position that looks like the martial if you really want to force it. But conversely, it's also the best position you're going to get as white against it. You've got the open a file for the rook, solid pawn structure. You haven't committed d4, c3, so the light squares aren't as weak. I mean, white has got the best martial that he's ever going to get, and Magnus decides against it and just decides to play d6 instead. So definitely some pretty serious preparation from Jan. He really wants to avoid the martial, and Magnus has shown in previous games that he's willing to jump over hoops to try to get that martial position, or at least threaten it. But we see a closed Ruy, and after c3, b4 was played by the world champion, and this makes more sense once you see the move c3. Playing the move b4 immediately, it just doesn't feel like it's really doing anything, because after d3, white's knight will go to d2 and into c4. And the light squares for black are going to become very weak. So in this current position after c3, well, now if you play c4, it's just a terrible move, blocks your own bishop. And black is going to take here, opening up his rook and exerting some pressure on the bishop. So while white enjoys the a file, now black's rook enjoys the b file. And move d3 was played in reaction by Nepo. If the move d4 was played, which, believe me, I mean, after c3, this is usually the intention, then I think black would be happy to take on c3, for example. And if black took on d4 and played d5, this is sometimes a pretty standard reaction to the move d4. d5, all of a sudden white isn't really interested in taking this. Look how many pawns have just completely disappeared from the board. And if e5, the knight comes to e4. The knight also owns the b4 square, and with c5 coming, the whole center is kind of getting undermined here. And this bishop is still a little bit loose. I don't think white has any issues here, but neither does black. It seems like a position that Magnus would be happy. It's open. The knights have very good squares that they can get to, and the center is very easy to undermine with a move like c5. So that's why I think Jan decided against d4. He didn't want to commit too early, and instead just wanted d3 and sort of a more slow game with less risk. As I think now that we've seen this position in game 5 as well as the 4 previous games, it's very clear to me at least that Nepomniachtchi in this match does not want to take a lot of risk. I mean, for obvious reasons, it's a world championship match. He's the underdog, but it seems very clear to me that even in the positions where I think he has a slight edge, he's not pushing it, with as much decisiveness as I think he needs. So takes d5. Now at this point, you have to, right? If you don't play d5, then Magnus is really admitting that Nepo's position is totally fine, because if you don't play d5, let's say bishop e6, right? Something like this. Let's say takes. Now, in the long term, white's going to play, d4, something like that. But now d5 is a little bit harder to achieve. The knight wants to reroute, knight e7 to g6, pretty normal, but hard to achieve that as well because the bishop sits there. Meanwhile, these pieces for white are very easy to develop. Bishop e3, knight d2, d4 coming, and then things like rook a6 and queen a4 just starting to pressure the other side of the board. So while the position here is definitely, it's not losing by any stretch for black, it's just not a very interesting position. There's no forward plans. d5 often might drop this pawn, but d5, when you have these double pawns, a little bit less desirable. The e6 pawn gets a little bit weak, and surely white's going to try to focus on that. So we see the move d5 and knight d2 as a response. So what is everyone asking? Because, of course, this pawn can be taken on e5. Is, how does Magnus get these moves to work when he is just seemingly hanging a pawn? Now let's say it gets taken. If takes back, takes here, bishop e6 looks pretty normal, and in the current position, the evaluation here is so strong for black that it's basically full compensation for the pawn. What we have here is a marshal, quote unquote, with the d5 move, but look at white's pieces, right? Black has developed, a number of his pieces in the meantime. Knight takes c3 is a threat here with his bishop hanging, and bishop f6 is now a threat with this pawn hanging. So there's so many reasons why this position is better than, the starting position of the marshal. So white accepting the pawn now would be even worse than if he had done it, 4 or 5 moves ago. So that's why Magnus finds a way once again to get his d5 move. That's clear that this is sort of his game plan. He's workshopping positions that he can play d5 in, get that little bit of space, and we see bishop d6, which is a nice move. It guards e5, and it gets ready to execute a plan. Knight e7, knight g6, very standard in the Rui for black. Knight d2 to f1 to g3 for white is the exact same plan. Queen c2, h6, which was a little bit weird because this move wasn't threatened. I think black could get away with this. For example, knight e7, if knight f1, knight g6, and then bishop to g5 for some reason, then you can play h6. Right? You're happy to take back. No harm, no foul. So I thought that this move was maybe a little bit slow or unnecessary. Magnus obviously has his reasons, but the reason why I pointed out is because the resulting position, of course, everyone gets their knight there, very happy, and Magnus is going for a trade on the e6 square. He does not want to double the pawns anymore. The reason that I point out this move is the resulting position, as we go through mass trades here, white is able to sink a knight on the f5 square very nicely. And the reason why h6 makes a knight on f5 better, which might not be apparent at first glance, is that black can't play g6 to kick it out, because the knight, and even the bishop in this case, attack the pawn on h6. So black would need to play king h7, knight g8, knight e7, and then g6. Knight g8 to guard the h6 pawn. So there's so many steps required to kick a knight out of f5. And if you take a look at the bishops, dark square bishops, meaning the pawns on light squares, is going to benefit white. And this guy is fixed on light square. Black's pawn is fixed on a dark square, the same color as his bishop. For all these reasons, to me, white holds a very slight advantage here. But the position is so symmetrical, pawns on the same side of the board, that it just doesn't seem like enough to beat the world champion. And we see some exchanges, rook b8, rook a6, and there's no rush to sink that knight in there, but you always can play the move knight f5. So I do think Nepomniachtchi is a little bit better. I wonder if Magnus had this position with white, how much would he push the position? That always comes, the question always comes into my head when I see this, because I didn't think that Nepo posed that many problems this game, even though I think he was slightly better for most of the game. So it wasn't a bad game by Nepo, but that's where I come back to my point about the decisiveness. I think that if you're going to win this match as Nepomniachtchi, you have to be pushing these small advantages a little bit better than he is right now. Or maybe Magnus is just a defensive god, but while that may be true, I think Nepo could still make Magnus work for these half points a little bit more. Knight sinks into f5, and I mean, white's knights are so much better than black's. It's just hard to break through, right? And we see he's starting to improve the position, pawns on light squares, right? And then even this pawn getting to h5 is all part of the plan, but still, it goes back to the question, what's wrong with black's position? Yes, it's, pawns are on the wrong color, it's a little bit more passive, less space, but there's no targets for white, right? Everything is protected. c7 is guarded like so many times, and we just see that knight d6, black manages to get a trade in, h5, white's doing everything right. Pawns on light squares, beautiful. It's gorgeous, gorgeous position. But, the engines are going to give this triple zeros, dead draw all around, and the world champion, while he knows he's definitely not in a position of strength here, I don't think he was concerned about losing this position. As we see rook d5 looking for a trade, this is a very undesirable endgame for black to be in. Probably just losing c4, king d3, maybe c5, and this knight long-term keeps a piece tied down. All pawns on light squares, so this would be a clinic. But of course, world champion is not doing that. If he's going to trade rooks, it's going to be here, but even still, you see he keeps the rooks on the board, and a repetition by moves, as Nepo's looking for a rook trade, and Magnus is not having any of it. So, what can we say? Round number 5, the game does end in a draw, so we've had 5 straight draws to start this World Championship match. We are going to have another rest day, so there'll be another little break before I see you guys again for one of these recaps for game number 6. But Magnus has shown resilience with the black pieces. Nepo has shown pretty good preparation with the white pieces. I think he's had a slight advantage in most of his games, but I just don't think he's pushing them very, very hard at all. And if you're not doing that against Magnus and you're not winning those games with white, then it's pretty much a field day when Magnus has the white pieces. So that concerns me for Nepo in this match. But the other good thing for him is that the more draws you see, I think the better it is for Nepomniachtchi. He's finding his footing. He's getting used to the World Championship match. And certainly, he's happy to draw these games. So, see you guys again for game number 6. But game number 5 between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen was a draw.